there are plenty of publications, especially popular publications, celebrating the food movement. The food movement writ large, everything from Michael Pollan to Will Allen to Mary Nesselt. It goes on, and it addresses the entire value chain, and even the pleasure of food, and slow food. We do have a vibrant food movement in the United States like nowhere else, actually, that I've seen. Even going to Italy, teaching in Italy, people are very concerned about food. In fact, there's all we talk about at the Gastronomic University. But I wouldn't say there's a food movement in the same way that we have a food movement here. Certainly don't have agricultural workers identifying or aligning with food movements. You don't have people from underserved communities or immigrant communities talking about the food movement as a way of addressing the lack of rights that immigrants have in society. And yet we do have that here. And there's, as I say, there's quite a bit of celebrating going on. And I think it's justified. There are incredible things going on, especially here in New York City. And every time I come, I learn about something else new which is happening in one of the boroughs or in Manhattan around food, which is quite innovative. And you're familiar with all of these, the CSAs and the farmers markets and the farm-to-school programs, and now there's all kinds of action and research going on. It's fantastic. The same is true for California, and if you drive across the greatest food desert in the world, which is the Midwest, you also find all kinds of things going on. So the question is, if these things are so great, why isn't everybody doing it? Why are they still the alternative rather than the norm? This, I think, is, while it is somewhat reflected internationally, one can't drill down in the same way on these questions. Right. I mean, certainly, of the 1 billion hungry people around the world, most are people of color. Most are women. Even though they produce about 70% of the world's food, they also make about 70% of the world's hungry. And just as a parenthesis with this, I like to show this graph because there's a very productivist paradigm about how we're going to end hunger in the world, which is reproduced in this country to a tremendous degree, in some degree, within the food movement itself, which is we just have to produce more food. And we're supposed to either double or produce 70% more food by 2050, or we're all going to die. Well, we won't all die, but plenty of people will. But the question is, where did that number even come from? And how is it applied? For example, the Green Revolution, the new Green Revolution, which is being touted by Bill Gates and his new project called Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, basically trots out this trope of productivist trope that we need to double food production, and of course, Africans don't know how to do this. We're going to have to bring them the Green Revolution, which supposedly bypassed Africa. Well, if Bill Gates really believes that the Green Revolution can end hunger, then why doesn't he take it to Asia, which is where most of the hungry people in the world are? Not sub-Saharan Africa. And of course the answer is because Asia already had a Green Revolution. And it certainly didn't solve hunger there. So it would be a bit embarrassing to bring it around a second time. I'm not sure people would be too excited. As there is, even though there has been more and more demand, there hasn't been enough demand to absorb all the food which is being produced, and so on the market, the price of food goes down. It's a straight line equation. Until, with a few spikes for wars and oil prices, this type of thing. Until 2008, when we have the world food crisis, and the price of food literally goes off the charts, higher than anything that's ever been reported for the food price index. In 2008, it spikes, goes down, the World Food Program steps up the release of a lot of food, and the price of food goes down again, and then it jumps again in 2011. The red lines, which you see on the graph, are what we call food riots. So what you can see is that when the food price index gets up over a certain threshold, approaching 200, you begin to have food riots in countries where governments are unable to provide food to people who can't afford it. So that happens in a lot of countries which we would expect that to happen. So in Haiti, there's a riot. There are food riots in sub-Saharan Africa, but there are food riots in places where you would expect, like Italy or Milwaukee. We have food riots. It's very clearly a problem of people not being able to afford food, and then the safety net not being there to bring food. We stopped calling them food riots after we looked closely at Haiti, because in Haiti, when people did riot, they didn't storm the warehouses where food was kept from the 40 program. Miami rice exported from the United States, which is given away, was not going to be sold. But they didn't do that. They stormed the National Palace and drove the Prime Minister off the island, basically. Because they were not just rioting, they were rebelling against an unjust food system, which was unable to solve this very simple equation. Here is the food, here are the people, why can't we just bring them together? And then the second spike in 2011, which you see there, a greater frequency of food rebellions. And this is where we understand this really are food rebellions. That's the Arab Spring. So this really concerned government leaders around the world. It certainly concerned G8 and the World Bank and the IMF and the WTO and the UN, who's promptly held a number of summits to address the food crisis. Because it's one thing to have a food price spike, it's quite another thing to have a government fall. And this is bad for world stability, it's bad for business. However, when we look at it, we realize that it's also very good for business. Because in both 2008 and 2009, we had record harvests, record hunger, and record profits. So the monopolies that control that 15% of food which actually crosses borders were making windfall profits when the price of food went up. And they're the usual suspects: the big grain companies, the big retail companies, and the input companies. Of course, that wasn't all. We also had, as prices began to rise, they became very interesting to the financial sector, who helped to pump up the price even more and made a killing on Wall Street, basically, and in Chicago, on the increase. So these companies were asked how ethical it was to be making billions of dollars in windfall profits while a billion people were going hungry. And they said, well, don't ask us, how much money we make. Ask us what we do with it. Okay, well, what do you do with it? Well, we reinvest it, of course. And that's clear. The reason why that is so important is evident in the next graph. It says MON at the top. That stands for Monsanto. That's Monsanto's stock price. So as you can see, Monsanto's stock price goes up when the price of food goes up, as people get more and more hungry, or more and more people go hungry. And Monsanto's stock price goes down, which means that shareholders are pulling out of Monsanto when the price of food goes down. So, what does Monsanto need in order to maintain its shareholders? It needs another crisis. And of course it got one. Now, I'm not saying that Monsanto single-handedly engineered the crisis. Someone else can say that. But I'm saying that this is the logic of the market, basically. And what happens here is that both Monsanto and Cargill and Carrefour, value chain have a crisis of accumulation. So it's great to have windfall profits, but then what do you do with them? You absolutely do have to reinvest them. Because if you don't, all this liquid cash, liquid capital, loses value. Money doesn't have much value. That's why interest rates are so low. That's the cost of money, right? So you don't want to have your wealth in money. It's the last place you want to keep it at this point. You need to reinvest that. That's sort of the law of capitalism. You've got to reinvest capital so you can make more capital. That's that's the definition of capital. The problem is that in 2008 we have the financial crisis, and there's nowhere to invest all these windfall profits. So what is to be done? Well, on one hand, if we're going to live with a market with extreme volatility, which is what we have, we need another crisis. On the other hand, put it somewhere where it's not going to lose value, which of course is land. And so we have the advent of the wave of land grabs around the world. Very shady, for the most part very big land deals, where land is being purchased all over the place, from both urban and rural, in the north and in the south. But thus far, all of the fanfare has been about big purchases in the south, because they're huge. They usually negotiate with governments, and it's very hard to get information. There's usually quite a bit of corruption involved, and there are sort of these spectacularly bad things that everybody can recognize as bad, and they're very difficult to dress up as a good investment, even though the World Bank has tried very hard with responsible agricultural investment policies, which are all voluntary, of course. But beneath these spectacular grabs around the world, we have a steady onslaught of small grabs. 5 acres, 10 acres, 15 acres, 20 acres. We see this maybe as urban expansion or as gentrification. It really is sort of the modern agrarian transition, where, in fact, in particular, the commons is being privatized, is being enclosed. Common lands everywhere from city parks, common spaces, to huge areas of rangeland are being privatized either through outright ownership, in which case very often the value of the land and the mortgages and what can be financialized and be traded internationally, or through leases, long-term leases. But the point is that people are being driven off the land, and people are being denied access to land. So at the same time that we're talking about food access, people are being denied access to the resources to produce food. Think about when we lose the commons, we lose this public sphere where we share power. And there are all kinds of commons. There are intellectual commons. There's a public sphere for intellectual thought and intellectual products, where we share these things. And we're losing those. Just as we're losing very material things like land. And I think that that's been increasingly clear over the last just 6 months, what the effects of the disappearance of the public sphere in our communities brings. An increase in violence, increase in diarrheic diseases, an increase in the vulnerability of our societies, particularly those who were most vulnerable to begin with, underserved communities and communities of color. And now these levels of vulnerability are, of course, incurring to the middle class. So when students in universities come out with a liberal arts degree and $60,000, $70,000 of debt, that is, in fact, a result of the loss of the public sphere, which then get the loss of the public goods, which would be scholarships, for example. And this has a hobbling effect on political activity. One of the tremendous difficulty of organizing students today is they're so indebted. And until we have a debtors cartel, for students it's going to be very difficult for students to organize politically. And one might say this is precisely the case, because if we look through history, we look at the function of debt and why those who loan the money don't actually ever want to be fully paid. Just a continuous stream of interest is fine, thank you very much. And the example of that, of course, is with the Third World Debt Crisis and then the structural adjustment policies that followed. And with this slide, I just want to follow the construction of what Harry Friedman and Phil McMichael call the food regimes. Because we have to ask, and I think this helps us to answer, why is this happening? And why is it that, in spite of tremendous evidence about how the food system could be structured to be more sustainable and more equitable, in fact, things seem to be going the other way. And if we look at the construction of the food regimes, they start basically in the colonial period, starting in the 16th century, where Western powers, imperial powers, basically colonized the global south and accessing resources, including food, get a tremendous colonial subsidy, right, in order to industrialize. Keep food cheap, keep the inputs cheap, right? And so you get this tremendous industrial takeoff in the north. But food is flowing to a tremendous degree from the south to the north. And this doesn't mean that in the south that people were not still, to a tremendous degree, self-provisioning. In fact, that was very important. It's very important to have peasant families be relatively self-sufficient in food. And there are plenty of local markets in food, right? Because one wanted, either through coercion or enslavement or both, cheap labor. And so the reproduction of that labor was in part financed by those who were being exploited for that labor. Peasant labor, and one step away from peasant labor. And that, of course, happened in the north as well. So you close the commons, destroy local communities' capacity for sustainability, essentially, levy taxes, send workers into the factories where they can be paid cheaply, but there's a surplus transfer of wealth from the countryside to the city, both in the form of cheap labor, but the countryside also has to produce cheap food basket. This comes both from the south and from the countryside. So there's a process of sort of dual colonialization. The impact of the financialization of everything, of the liberalization of everything, of the privatization of everything, has been devastating on our communities, and the loss and the erosion of the public sphere has brought these social contradictions within vulnerable communities very much to the forefront. So the rise of police violence, incredible rise of police violence, in the militarization of our police force, over just the last couple of years. I mean, certainly starting with the fall of the Twin Towers, but intensified over the last few years, corresponds and correlates and is very much part and parcel of the stage of capitalism in which we find ourselves, financialization and privatization, or the liberalization of capitalism under this period. And our food regime basically reflects that. Our corporate food regime is a liberalized capitalist food regime. And so it should be no surprise to us that the rates of diet-related disease are off the charts for underserved communities. This corresponds perfectly to the flows of the concentration of capital around the world. Oxfam put out this study recently about the levels of inequality. And of course, Thomas Piketty wrote his book called Capital, and said he never read Capital, but I don't believe it. And yes, tremendous levels of inequality, which of course are not only inequitable, but completely unsustainable in terms of how we manage the world's resources, because the 85 people who own half of the world's wealth, of the bottom half of the world's wealth, $1.7 trillion, are following a logic of capital. They're not following the logic of sustainability. They're not following the logic of the commons. They're not following the logic of food, even food security, as we have seen with the food price crises of 2008 and 2011. They're following the logic of capital. So this level of inequality, of course, because of the erosion of the public sphere, also brings us tremendous power of decision to these 85 people and the rest of the 1% to make decisions. The good news here is that the peasantry still supplies most of the world's food. That's what this is all about. And they supply 85% of the world's food. Only 15% of food crosses international borders. But the industrial food system, the corporate food regime, has this controlling interest, which is 15%. It's a very powerful 15%. It's very concentrated, whereas the other 85% is completely dispersed. But essential, because basically poor people feed poor people. But that's what it's about. That's the market that this trope of we need to increase food production is after. They're not talking about increasing food production per se. They're talking about increasing their share of food production. That's what this is all about. But the good news is that this is still in the hands of largely the peasantry. In the United States, we have seen the rise of the food movement, largely in assistance, trying to assist people, helping them get access to food in many different ways. Even the gardening, the urban gardening, the sort of the small artisanal farms and production and whatnot. Yes, part of that is about boutique food, but part of that is very much about access to resources and land and good food. Some of this, I think, inadvertently reproduces the type of thinking which is causing the problem. Fixing the broken food system by voting with your fork. First, I have to say that I don't think the food system is broken at all. It's acting precisely as a food system in a period of late capitalism is supposed to act. It concentrates power and has monopolies and offloads all of the externalities onto the general public. It's doing a great job from within its logic. So, voting with your fork is sort of this consumer-based thing where we can send a message to the market about the type of food that you want. That's great if you have enough money to do that, but increasingly people don't have enough money to be able to eat according to their values. Remember, if you get nothing from my talk, except for this, remember, we have a capitalist food system, and you need to say it out loud. And don't be ashamed and don't be afraid. It's a capitalist food system, so it can only act the way capitalism acts. It can act no other way. And we know some things about capitalism. We've been studying it for a few hundred years now. Capitalism, according to Carl Polanyi, thanks to Carl Polanyi, we know that capitalism always goes through two phases. It goes through a period of liberalization and a period of reform. In liberalization, the gloves are taken off the market. That's with globalization. And basically the market begins to consume society and consume all the resources on the planet. It concentrates tremendous wealth. And there's always a big crash because of these crises of accumulation and whatnot. And then we enter into a period of reform where the market is regulated, labor is regulated, the environment is regulated, production is regulated in order to stabilize the system. And capitalism has been able to make it through history this way. Two other components that are important to know about is that it usually has to be a big threat for this to happen. And of course, the big threat after 1929 crash, there's to be a crash and a threat. So the crash, for example, in 1929 came after a period of liberalization in this country. Roosevelt is able to institute reforms. He starts with agriculture and institutes the New Deal because there's a huge threat, and that is it looked like capitalism was going to fall. And at that time, communism and socialism very strong counter-movement through the 30s, which took to the streets and allowed Roosevelt to institute reforms. So the important lesson there is that reforms don't come about through the good intentions of reformers. They come about through the power of social movements. And I'll leave you with this slide, which we know about the corporate food regime. The corporate food regime has two major tendencies. One is neoliberal, which is hegemonic at this moment, and the other is very reformist. They believe in the market just as the neoliberals do, but they believe in safety nets. So they believe in food security, whereas the neoliberals just believe in food enterprise. And these are just trends. They can split institutions. So the USDA, for example, you have Bill Sack, who's neoliberal, and Kathleen Merrigan, who was quite reformist and believed in food security. But the reformers are quite weak. And those of us who thought that maybe we're entering into a phase of reform where, with the election of President Barack Obama, have been disabused of that notion. Why have we not seen substantive reforms? Because we don't have a strong enough social movement to create the political will. We certainly have the crash, and we certainly have the threat, which is climate change. So if we look at the food movement today, both nationally and internationally, we see a progressive and a radical trend within the food movement. The progressives is most of us in their neighborhoods, trying to do the best we can, working with the USDA, working with whomever we have to work in order to get people food, in order to get them access to land, starting land trusts, trying to make food nicer through fair trade labeling or organic labeling, trying to mainstream the good things, this type of stuff, right? And then we have the radicals who believe in food sovereignty, who want to change the rules and the institutions. We want to tear down the World Bank, want to get food out of the WTO, want redistributive land reform. So I think if we want a strong counter-movement capable of creating the political will to not just reform but transform the food system, we don't want reforms to take us back to where we were before. We want reforms which are transformational and take us forward. We're going to need a powerful food movement in which the progressives and the radicals are strategically aligned. Because the progressives, who are quite pivotal, you are all quite pivotal, if you align yourselves strategically, not tactically, I don't care tactically, but strategically with the reformists, I don't think we're going to get reforms. Reformists don't bring about reforms, because this will split the power of the food movement down the middle. And we won't get reforms. And we won't get any change. We certainly won't get any transformation. So I think the pivotal challenge for the food movement is to build the alliances with the radical trends. And what is keeping that from happening? One is the loss of the public sphere. And the other is racism, not just in the food system, but in our food movement. We cannot build strong alliances if our food movement, if we don't dismantle racism in our food movement. And I see people nodding their heads, you know that this is a problem. And very often it's simply not talked about. Now very often it is that people doing fantastic work, who've done a lot of work about historical trauma, about oppression, about internalized oppression, and about white privilege. And if we don't address these things, and we don't begin to dismantle white privilege, and we don't begin to support leadership from communities of color, I not only fear for our food system, I fear for our planet. I think that the changes that we can make in this country through the food movement by dismantling racism are historically pivotal. This is a huge challenge. It's extremely difficult, otherwise we would have done it. So to end, I'll just say, let's try to vision a food system built on sort of transformational solidarity, which has been called for by Black Lives Matter. It helps us to overcome historical trauma of racism and build on a transformative vision by asking ourselves, what would our food system be if food workers were food secure? If farm workers received living wages and had decent working conditions no matter their immigration status?